There was a version of you that existed before you became careful. This version was loud in the specific way that children are loud. Not obnoxious, not broken, just unedited. This version of you said exactly what they thought the moment they thought it, cried in public without shame, laughed too hard at things that weren't that funny, walked into rooms and simply existed in them, fully, without first performing a threat assessment. You remember this version, maybe only faintly. Maybe it feels like trying to remember a dream. You can sense the emotional texture of it, but you can't quite hold the image still. And then something happened. It wasn't dramatic. For most people watching this, there was no single explosion, no identifiable catastrophe. There was something quieter and, in many ways, more devastating than catastrophe. There was a signal, a look, a sigh, a laugh from the wrong direction at the wrong moment, a parent who went silent when you needed them to stay, someone who loved you or was supposed to love you, who showed you without ever using these words that the version of you that was currently standing in the room was too much, or perhaps just as wounding, not enough. And in that moment, your brain did something that it has never stopped doing since. It made a calculation. That calculation is what we are here to talk about today, because that calculation, made in a fraction of a second decades ago by a nervous system that was simply trying to keep you safe, is running in the background of your life right now, this afternoon, in your relationships, in the way you hesitate before you speak, in the way you sometimes feel, even in rooms full of people who love you, like you are watching your own life through glass. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what that calculation was, and more importantly, you are going to understand why you are finally, structurally, allowed to override it. Here is the question I want you to hold for the next 10 minutes. What did you have to bury in order to be loved? Not abandoned, not rejected, loved by the specific, imperfect people who were responsible for you. Because here's what makes this particular wound so difficult to see clearly. The people who sent the signal were not, in most cases, monsters. They were people, often people who were themselves carrying wounds they had never examined. Often people who genuinely loved you and had absolutely no idea what they were teaching you. What they were teaching you was this: belonging has conditions, and the conditions were specific to you. Maybe it was your emotional intensity, the way you felt things so loudly that it made the adults around you uncomfortable. Maybe it was your questions, the relentless probing why that exhausted people who had stopped asking why long ago. Maybe it was your sensitivity, your pickiness, your need for depth in a family that operated on the surface. Whatever it was, you learned. Faster than most, with more precision than almost anyone. You learned exactly which parts of yourself were safe to show and which parts needed to go somewhere else. Today, I'm going to show you where they went, and I'm going to show you something that psychology has only recently begun to articulate clearly. The thing that protected you then is the exact thing that is quietly dismantling your capacity for joy now. We have a story we tell about this in popular psychology, and I want to challenge it. The story goes like this. You experienced some form of rejection or invalidation as a child, and so you built a false self, a mask, to protect your true self underneath. The work of healing, the story says, is to take off the mask and let the true self emerge. It is a beautiful story. It is also, I believe, incomplete, and the incompleteness is what keeps so many deeply perceptive people, people exactly like you, stuck in a loop of self-help content that resonates but never quite lands. Here is the more precise version. When you were young, you did not build a mask, you built something far more sophisticated than a mask. You built an entire architecture, a structure so complete and so internally consistent that it did not sit on top of yourself, it became your operating system. Psychologists call this the adaptive self, and understanding what it actually is, not a lie you're living, but a solution your nervous system engineered, is the reframe that changes everything. When your authentic expression, your loudness, your sensitivity, your questions, your need for depth, when that expression was met consistently with coldness or correction or the particular silence that means please stop, your nervous system did not give up. It adapted. It ran a calculation, and the calculation was not irrational. For a small child, it was, in fact, the most rational calculation available. Authenticity causes pain. Performance creates safety. I will become excellent at performance. And you did. You became extraordinary at it. You became so fluent in the language of what other people needed from you that you could read the room before you walked into it. You could modulate your voice, your energy, your expressed desires in real time, continuously, without anyone ever knowing it was happening. Your adults around you called it maturity. They called it being easy. They called it having a good head on your shoulders. What it actually was, and I want you to really feel this rather than just process it intellectually, what it actually was the most elaborate disappearance act in human psychology. You didn't put on a mask, you swallowed yourself, and then you became so skilled at performing the version of you that the world could accept that somewhere along the line, you lost track of the difference. And this is why you can be 35 years old, or 45, or 55, with a life that by every external measure looks successful, good relationships, functional career, people who love you, and still feel at some frequency just below conscious thought, like an imposter in your own existence. There is a concept in developmental psychology called the wound of conditional belonging. It describes what happens when a child's primary environment, family, school, the earliest social world, communicates through action or omission that love and acceptance are available but conditional. Available when you are performing correctly, withdrawn when you are not. The child does not experience this consciously. They are not sitting down and thinking through the terms and conditions of their family's love. They are simply doing what all nervous systems do. They are learning the pattern. And the pattern they learn is this: the authentic self, the loud one, the feeling one, the asking one, the too much one, that self produces uncertainty. It sometimes produces warmth, but it also produces withdrawal. It is unpredictable. The adapted self, the agreeable one, the useful one, the one who monitors the room and gives people what they need, that self produces approval, consistently, reliably, safely. Your nervous system, which above all else is a prediction machine, chooses safety every time. Over years, over a childhood, over an adolescence, this stops being a choice and becomes a default. The adapted self is no longer a strategy you are consciously deploying. It is simply who you are, or rather, it is simply who you have learned to be. And this is why the story takes a turn that most self-help content never quite reaches. The tragedy is not that you built the adaptive self. The tragedy is that it worked. You became the reliable friend, the thoughtful partner, the person in the room who can navigate any social dynamic without causing friction. You got the belonging you were optimizing for. People love you, genuinely, deeply. And yet, there is a specific loneliness that only people who have lived this way understand. It is not the loneliness of being alone. It is the loneliness of being surrounded, seen, celebrated, and still, underneath it all, waiting for the moment when they finally see the part of you that wasn't performing, waiting to find out what happens then. That waiting is exhausting in a way that is almost impossible to explain to someone who has not felt it. I want to ask you something personal. Do you know who you are when absolutely no one is watching? Not who you are when you are alone but could be observed. Not who you are when you are journaling, because even journaling has an imagined audience. I mean the version of you that exists in the 30 seconds after you close the door, before you pick up your phone, before you perform anything for anyone, including yourself. Do you know that person? For many people who grew up building the adaptive self, the honest answer is not very well. Because here is the specific trap at the center of this pattern, and this is the part that I think deserves more airtime than it ever gets in conversations about masks and false selves. The adaptive self is not a costume you wear over your real self. It is a habit of attention. You have practiced, for years, attending outward, reading rooms, reading people, reading relationships, with such consistency and skill that attending inward has become genuinely unfamiliar. Not impossible, just unfamiliar, like a muscle that has been strong in one direction for so long that moving it in the other direction feels strange and slightly dangerous. What does this look like in daily life? It looks like being the person everyone comes to for advice, while having no idea what you yourself actually need. It looks like being extraordinarily good at your work, while feeling secretly hollow at the center of it. It looks like being deeply loving in your relationships while struggling to receive love in return, not because you don't want it, but because being given something requires you to be a specific, bounded, demanding self, and that self is the one you buried. It looks like scrolling through your own memories of the past year and realizing that very little of what happened actually happened to you. Most of it happened around you while you managed it. And underneath all of this, underneath the competence and the warmth and the genuine care, there is a belief so quiet and so foundational that most people who hold it have never once examined it directly. I am only safe when I am useful. I am only lovable when I am easy. If I stop performing, the belonging stops. That belief is the cage, and the cruelest thing about it is that from the inside, it does not feel like a cage, it feels like wisdom. The insight shift, the adaptive self as hero. Here is the reframe that I need you to really receive, not just understand, but receive. Your adaptive self is not your enemy. I want to say that again because self-help culture has a tendency to create villains out of our coping mechanisms, and I think it does real damage. Your adaptive self was a hero. It was constructed by a child, you at some young age, who looked at their environment and correctly assessed that the fullness of their authentic expression was not safe in that space. And that child, who had no other options, who could not leave, who could not negotiate, who could not wait until they found a better environment, that child did the most extraordinary thing. They built a bridge, not a cage, a bridge between who they were and what the world could tolerate, and they walked across it every single day for years, keeping themselves safe, keeping the belonging intact, navigating a world that was not designed for the depth and intensity of what they actually were. That is not weakness. That is a form of intelligence so sophisticated that most adults never develop it. The problem, the only problem, is that bridges are not meant to be permanent residences. A bridge is infrastructure. You build it to get somewhere. And at some point, the question becomes, have I arrived? And if so, can I finally stop living in the middle of the crossing? You are not 7 years old anymore. You are not dependent on the people who sent the original signal. The threat that the adaptive self was built to navigate, the threat of being cast out, of losing belonging, of being too much for the people who were responsible for you, that threat in its original form is gone. What remains is the response pattern. The nervous system still runs the old software in new environments. It still treats every room like the room it learned to survive in, every relationship like the relationship where it first learned that being seen was dangerous. And that is not a character flaw. That is just how nervous systems work. They are conservative. They prefer the known danger to the unknown safety. They would rather repeat a painful pattern they understand than risk an open, unscripted moment they don't. But you, the conscious, adult, deeply perceptive person that you are, you have the capacity to show your nervous system something new. You have the capacity to tell it in the only language it actually understands, not words, but experience, that it is safe to be seen. Reclaiming yourself from decades of adaptive performance is not a weekend project. I want to be honest with you about that. There is no single exercise that reaches into the architecture and rearranges it overnight. But there are practices that begin to shift the foundation. And the key insight is that they work not through grand gestures, but through small, repeated, genuine moments of visibility. Your nervous system learned safety the same way it learned danger, through consistent repetition. The first is what I call the small true thing. Today, not someday, today, I want you to state a small preference that you would normally suppress. Not because it matters enormously what you eat for dinner or which movie you watch, but because the practice of saying what is actually true for you in this moment out loud to another person is the act of existing as a specific self. Do it when the stakes are low. That is how you build the muscle. The second is the allowed feeling. Choose one emotion you have been treating as forbidden: anger, jealousy, disappointment, need, and give it 5 minutes of privacy. Do not perform it, do not judge it, do not immediately reach for the insight about what it means. Just feel it, fully. You were taught that certain internal states were too much for the people around you. The healing begins with discovering that they are not too much for you. The third is the unearned no. Say no to one thing this week, not because you have a good reason, not because you're sick or overwhelmed or have a legitimate conflict, just because you do not want to. Because you are a person who is allowed to have preferences that do not require justification. The adaptive self says no only when it can provide documentation. Your actual self is allowed to simply say, "Not this time," and let that be complete. Each of these is small. Each of them is sending the same signal to the same nervous system that learned decades ago to stay hidden. The war is over. You can come out. I said at the beginning of this video that something was waiting. Here is what it is. It is not your true self in the way self-help usually means it, some perfect, undamaged original version that just needs to be uncovered. That framing is too clean. You have been shaped by experience, and that shaping is permanent, and it is also, in the deepest sense, you. What is waiting is simpler than that. It is the permission. The permission to want things without apologizing for wanting them. The permission to be in a room and not be responsible for the emotional temperature of that room. The permission to be loving specifically, not as a function, not as a mirror, not as the person who makes everything easier, but as a self, particular, opinionated, occasionally difficult, fully present. The child who learned to disappear did not disappear because they were too much. They disappeared because the people around them did not yet have the capacity to hold what they were. But you are no longer in that room, and the people who choose to be in your life now, the ones worth keeping, they have that capacity. The only question remains is whether you will finally let them use it. You have been in the middle of the bridge long enough. It is time to arrive.